All right, let's deal with yesterday. Yesterday, what did we do? We went through Kant's system and we saw that there were two basic faculties of cognition, two basic faculties for knowing, sensibility and understanding. Sensibility was immediate and it was, well, sensible in sensory form, and it was receptive. With respect to it, the material it gives us, we experience it passively. The representations we get sensibly through sensibility are intuitions, and we saw that space and time were the a priori forms that all intuitions, that is, all sensible material, must conform to. Then we looked at the understanding, which is immediate, that is indirect kind of, which has immediate representations, that is, it has representations of representations. Concepts are of intuitions. We saw that concepts were organized by the a priori concepts of the categories, and that these corresponded to 12 basic logical kinds of judgment. Where we had left off, we were discussing Kant's examination of the necessity of these a priori concepts, and we showed that what we were discussing was that Kant thought it was not sufficient enough just to point out a feature of objects as they always seem to appear in our experience, since that would only tell us it had thus far shown up, but instead we would have to deduce the necessary features of any possible experience in order to determine which a priori concepts had to always be in place. And let me add here that while when we employ an empirical concept, Kant thinks, so not an a priori concept, but a concept we form from experience, then there has to be something in an intuition which the concept conforms to. In other words, if I don't have some horse stuff in the intuition, the horse concept is not to be applied. But not so with the a priori concepts. There is no particular thing in intuitions to which the various categories correspond. And so the challenge is to show why it must be that the categories must apply onto this spatio-temporal series of sensations when in themselves they lack what the categories bring. In other words, the raw data that comes in lacks a causal structure. It lacks a substance-accidents relationship. It lacks interaction among its parts. And yet, the a priori concepts, the categories, give that to it. So, how does he go about showing that these are necessary? Well, we said that he thought that the way to do it was to show that these concepts were necessary for a coherent kind of experience. In particular, experience had to be of objects, which is basically entities with identity, and that there had to be a kind of stable flow of time from one moment to the next that was not chaotic, and that could only be ensured if we had stable entities. And what described or what characterized a stable or coherent flow of experience was that in each moment of it, we could recognize it as belonging to the same self. That is, that it was the same subject, the same I, who was experiencing this moment, and then it wasn't as if suddenly there was a new world and where am I? It was, okay, I'm having this experience, now I'm having the experience of looking at that side of the room, this is still me, which is to say, only with that kind of continuity in myself would I even be able to have a continuity of the world around me. And where we finished off, where we got to, were the analogies of experience. We looked at the first two, and we're going to leave aside the third. In the analogies of experience, Kant specifically shows how the certain categories, the categories of relationship, that is, how two different representations, two different intuitions are connected to each other, how this sort of connection is absolutely necessary to have coherent experience. And what we showed was that he would take something like self-consciousness and its various aspects, such as its temporal continuity, or its distinction that is the distinction from the subject of the object, right? That self-consciousness could tell itself apart from the things it was consciousness of, right? So these various features, inherent features of self-consciousness, and use them to show that we couldn't, and then we showed that we couldn't have those without certain necessary features within experience that these various a priori concepts, namely substance and cause and effect, causality, would guarantee. So just to recap really quickly, in the first analogy we see that one couldn't identify this as all the same timeline of the same world from moment to moment unless something was enduring through it. And since time itself can't be perceived, there has to be something else by means of which we know that there is this temporal continuity, that the next moment is the next moment of the same world, or that these time bits are connected. It's interesting because what we ought to say is that there's a continuous world, and then time is our measurement of the relative changes within it, rather than taking what is a higher order sort of relationship which consciousness grasps between relative changes and saying, well, that has to stay stable, reality must be fixed for it. In other words, it's a hierarchy inversion here. Nevertheless, it is the case that we absolutely couldn't know that it was the same me from moment to moment, or that this moment of experience is just is an experience of the very same world as before, unless there was something that did endure. So he's correct in saying that, you need this for that. Indeed, one of the functions of axiomatic concepts that Rand points out is time continuity, which is to say, which has two aspects or two purposes. One, we have to apply the axiomatic concepts in every item of knowledge. They're always to be used. They're always at work in any other concept, in any other perception, etc. But the other aspect of time continuity is that axiomatic concepts emphasize, in a way that other concepts don't specifically emphasize, the fact of time, the omission of time measurements. In other words, all concepts that, I have a concept dog, and that refers to dogs past, present, future. At any time, time is irrelevant here. Obviously, there are some temporal concepts like today. But today could be any day which you happen to be in at the time you're saying it. So even a time-specifying concept has time measurement omission. But the axiomatic concepts make a point about this. They put their finger on it and say, yes, existence, before, now, hereafter. Consciousness, that I was experiencing before, now, hereafter, anytime I'm experiencing. So what it does, they are the conceptual way of identifying the fact that it is one and the same existence, and that the concept, the axiom of consciousness is the conceptual integration of the unity of our own consciousness, of our own person. That is, they're a conceptual way of keeping tabs on that. And so in this respect, it's not a mistake to understand that indeed, you could not have time continuity. Metaphysically, you couldn't have time continuity without existence existing, full stop. But furthermore, epistemologically speaking, without at least an implicit grasp that this is the same world as a moment before and a moment hence, that too, you couldn't really, without that, it would be sort of invalid to even speak of a passage of time, because the relative measures of change of what? I mean, if they're totally two distinct sets of entities, you're in a new universe in the next moment. It's not a change, it's a complete replacement of existence. And I mean, this is not supposed to be something you can really imagine, but that's the idea. Okay. So that was in the first case, the first analogy. In the second analogy, we see that in order to be able to distinguish what my subject is doing to change experience from what the objects are doing that changes my experience of them, in order to distinguish between what's just me closing my eyes versus what's you all turning black, I have to have some idea that there is regularity in what you are and what you do. And then I have to be able to see that the kind of change that my subjectivity brings is not the kind of thing that's making that change. In other words, opening my eyes, closing my eyes is not the kind of thing that makes John McCaskey look like he's raised his hand or lowered it, or in any particular order. But I couldn't do that. I couldn't know that it absolutely had to go in that way, and it's not just some freak fluke, unless there was some kind of causal order from moment to moment, or from thing to its action. So, now, let's, once again, as we just did a moment ago with the first analogy, let's compare that to the truth. Rand, for instance, discusses, and I think her account here is quite brilliant and insightful, how the child develops his first grasp of what we would call the primacy of existence. The first grasp that consciousness is distinct from existence and that the existence precedes consciousness. So a grasp of the subject-object distinction with the right relationship between them, that is priority to object. And this is what she says. She says, well, first, even in the first moment of awareness, the child implicitly gets the implicit concept of existence. Later on, once the child is able to perceive, it develops the implicit concept of entity. That is, it looks around in its visual field or it touches things, and it doesn't just get little qualities out of nowhere. I mean, what it perceives is objects, things, entities. It's only a subsequent conceptual differentiation that distinguishes things from their attributes, from their actions, etc. And then from thence, the child develops an implicit grasp of a concept of identity, that, hey, this thing is the way it is, and it's not some other way. And different objects are different from each other in respect to what they are, what they do. Lastly, when the child gets the implicit grasp of consciousness, that it is aware of the world, that it closes its eyes, the world goes away, it opens them, it comes back, but that's it. I mean, then this is how it can understand the difference between subject and object. It understands that these entities are there, that they are in a certain way. And part of that being in a certain way, part of identity here is causality, namely that there's some things they do and some things they don't. The child grasps its own consciousness and sees that it is not what is causally efficacious in the case of various changes in these entities. Consciousness is causally efficacious to let him see. And the identity of our visual faculty is such that if you close your eyes, if you shut off the incoming light, then you won't see. But the main point is to be able to see that it's because these entities have an identity, a causal identity. They do certain things. They don't just pop out. They didn't just go away. They don't just all suddenly turn black and then go back to the way they were. That allows the child to see, well, closing my eyes is not the world going away. It's me not looking, but that's distinct from the things which are still there even when my eyes are closed, which are still there even when they go behind a wall, etc. So here, again, Kant is not wrong. He's quite right and is making a deep insight that it's only by a recognition of definite identity or causal relationships of a thing and its action that allows us in the first place to distinguish what is the effect of us versus what is just the objects out there. Now remember, the objects we're talking about here are, say, an outer sense. And the self here is inner sense. This is still all in appearances. These objects are not things in themselves. But even within the realm of appearances, there's a distinction to be made between inner sense and outer sense. How do we get that? Okay. I think it's very interesting just to focus on this point for a moment, that with regard to making a world of entities, making a world of lasting existence, making a world where subject and object can be distinguished, Kant is in many ways getting sort of the metaphysics right, except that it's embedded in a phony world. In other words, he kind of recapitulates many true aspects of these relationships, only he's already made them subservient to consciousness and has taken them out of the real world. And I think this is, believe me when I say that previous philosophers had not grasped these important relationships or had done much, much less with them. There are little examples. Aquinas tries to work out how really non-contradiction is that prior to non-contradiction is just what is, existence or identity. And Aristotle talks about how non-contradiction is necessary for other knowledge. But Kant goes much further in showing how even the most simple, most fundamental aspects of our cognition rely on certain basic facts, certain facts which he thinks are given to experience by the categories, but which Objectivism or Aristotelianism would name as basic primary facts of reality itself. These are metaphysical facts. And so Kant's critics are reading him absolutely right when they, or his followers are reading him absolutely right when they say what were previously thought of as metaphysical laws, Kant took out of the thing in itself and made them the laws of experience. What's shocking, what's fascinating, is that he tends to pick the right laws, and he tends to get what the connection is between those fundamental metaphysical truths, those axioms, and our ability to have a continuous experience, to know the difference between ourselves and the world, etc. You like this, John? Okay. John wanted to know came in, of course, wanted to know how the categories and axiomatic concepts compare. And I think the point is that the categories are like axiomatic concepts, only the world is in our mind now and not the world. Even the mind, even the self, is a self within the mind, right? The empirical I. It's a self within experience. Okay, now, what's the difference? What's the difference between Kant showing that there must be absolute causal relationships that we can grasp of objects in order to distinguish self from world? What's the difference between him seeing that and, in the case I gave you of the child, Rand also seeing that? Both seem to say that you need to be able to know X, you would first need to know Y. Kant tends to say, when Kant makes these kinds of arguments, he talks about the grounds for the possibility of experience, or the grounds for the possibility of knowing blank. That means you couldn't ever even possibly know blank unless you could know this other thing, or unless this other thing were true about experience. How is that different from the process of reduction? What facts of reality give rise to the concept blank? I think the difference, I think the difference is absolutely fundamental, but it's in some respects subtle. Here, I think, is the point. The kind of argument that the argument from geometry from the first day, we have geometrical knowledge, and that couldn't be from things in themselves being spatial, and so space must be an a priori form of intuition. That kind of argument, these analogies, these are what subsequent commentators of Kant have labeled transcendental arguments. And what a transcendental argument is the following. One accepts as given, one just takes without question a certain kind of knowledge, usually a very fundamental kind of knowledge, such as that I can tell the difference between myself and the world, such as that I experience time as a continuity, such as that there's geometrical knowledge or that mathematics is certain. Okay. One takes it as given, that knowledge, and then one says, well, what would I need to know that? Well, I'd need to know that space would always have to conform to these certain strictures. Okay, and what would have to be the case for me to know that? Well, space would, as it is in my experience, always would have to be that way. Conclusion? Well, space must have to be that way because I have the knowledge of geometry, and I couldn't have that knowledge unless I could know space was always going to hold this way, and that's only guaranteed by there being a pure form for intuition of space, so there's got to be a pure form of intuition space. So it argues from an accepted, granted part of knowledge to there being some kind of metaphysical condition for that knowledge, by showing that only if one could have knowledge of the metaphysical grounds, could one have the initially assumed knowledge. So you have the initially assumed knowledge, geometry, world versus self, temporal continuity. You say, I know that, no questions asked. Step 2, I couldn't know that unless I know fundamental metaphysical fact X, so there must be fundamental metaphysical fact X. Okay, I've taken knowledge that I've assumed to give me metaphysics. Now bear in mind, of course, this is the metaphysics of the phenomenal world, not the noumenal world, and we're going to see in just a moment that that's extremely important. But let's go to the other approach first. What occurs in conceptual reduction? In conceptual reduction, we ask the question, what facts of reality give rise to this concept? And by that we mean, what are the facts, quite literally, that justify us grouping things in this way, and that require that we group them in this way? In other words, what's the need here, and what's the justification for solving that need in this way? But what is vitally important to recognize is that conceptual reduction does not take the initial putative concept as sacrosanct or as unquestioned. It says, I've got this concept, liberty. Is there anything to that? Well, let's see. And then I would look at various aspects of reality. I'd look at human nature and why man's consciousness needed to be free from the initiation of force. And then I would look at the fact that there are different kinds of social arrangements between human beings, some of which protect his mind and body from the initiation of force, and some of which do not. And I would recognize that it's absolutely vitally important for his life and survival that be protected. And thus I need something that can grasp when this certain kind of protection of his mind from the initiation of force is present or not. But until I've done that, until I've traced back through other more simple knowledge, closer to perceptual knowledge. So one traces back through knowledge, too, to get to these basic facts. I mean, it's not just from concept to fact. When one does that, it's not until one has shown that there is this need and there is this real ground in existence, in reality, that one can conclude that he has the right to use that concept. Now, that's fundamentally different from a transcendental argument, because the transcendental argument simply takes the knowledge as such and then makes demands on reality in order to make that knowledge grounded in the first place. And if you think about it, that's really the whole point of the Copernican revolution. Stop asking, what does our mind need to do if it's going to get reality, or what are the facts in reality, and how should we make our concepts suitable to deal with it? And instead one asks, how must whatever comes into experience be if it's to give consciousness what it wants? If it's to give it an organized universe? If it's to give it mathematical knowledge? Well, it better have space and time. Well, it better have substances, and it better have cause and effect. Now, there's one particular kind of valid good argument that looks especially like transcendental arguments. I call this a fundamentality argument. You might be familiar with arguments of these forms under the heading of refutations through denial. I think the most famous example in the history of philosophy is Aristotle's argument about the law of non-contradiction. Aristotle does not believe one can argue for the law of non-contradiction. It is an axiom, it is a self-evident fact. It's another perspective on the law of identity, slightly posterior to it, we could say. One can't prove it, but what one can prove is that it's absolutely fundamental to all the rest of our knowledge. So one can't prove the metaphysical fact, but one can prove something about the place of our knowledge of it in the hierarchy of knowledge. One can say, this is a fundamental metaphysical fact, and consequently, it's fundamental to all our knowledge. The knowledge of it is fundamental to all our knowledge. And that would go like, and how does he prove this? Well, what he does is he shows that no one could know anything, say anything coherently, even think anything, unless they accepted it. So that even a skeptic who claims that there are contradictions can't even make his case unless he implicitly relies on it. That is, he says, I believe there are contradictions. And I say back to him, yes, Protagoras, you believe that there aren't contradictions. He said, no, I said, I believe there are contradictions. Yes, Protagoras, you don't think there are contradictions. I'm glad you think that. He said, no, damn it, Aristotle, I say there are contradictions, and I do not say there are not contradictions. Well, come on. I mean, that's not actually, the argument goes a little bit differently in the details than that, but that's the basic idea to have in mind here. And notice again that the presupposition of this argument, what this argument starts from, is a metaphysical fact. That is the law of non-contradiction. One starts from, that's true, that's a rule of reality, and I know it. And then from the fact that this is a fundamental fact of reality, from the metaphysical, one is able to prove something about our knowledge of it, namely that it stands at the base of all knowledge. It is axiomatic. It is inescapable. It's utterly fundamental. And what confuses people, and many people have thought that this argument is a transcendental argument where Aristotle says, well, we couldn't have any knowledge unless we had the law of non-contradiction, we couldn't say anything coherently, we couldn't have any science, yada, 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 without the law of non-contradiction. And, we think we have conversations, we think we can talk, so there must be a law of non-contradiction. And I mean, it's not just bad philosophy, though I think it's bad philosophy that drives that interpretation. It's also bad scholarship, because he just says it's not a demonstration, twice. But anyway, the point is where people get confused is that what both of these do, what both of these have at the transcendental argument and this fundamentality argument have in the heart of them is an identification of the necessity for knowing some fundamental metaphysical fact in order to know something else. But in the fundamentality argument, one got the I know this fundamental metaphysical fact because one accepts directly the truth, the actuality of that metaphysical fact. That is, one starts from reality, the truth, metaphysics, and on that grounds grants oneself, says, I'm justified in saying the axiom because I see it's true, and then and then from there shows the dependency relationship. Whereas in the transcendental argument, one doesn't assume this metaphysical fact, one just assumes something in consciousness, some putative kind of knowledge or cognition. Then one does show that there is a priority relationship, a hierarchical relationship, a dependency relationship between that bit of knowledge and the knowledge of some metaphysical fact. So both of them have in the middle this kind of, the knowledge of this depends on the knowledge of this fundamental metaphysical fact. It's just one then ends by making a claim on the world, and the other starts from something about the world. And in this sense, you can see metaphysically the reduction and this fundamentality argument, metaphysically they're realists. They take the world as it is and don't let consciousness make demands of it. Epistemologically, they're what we could call foundationalists. That is, you just have to accept certain facts directly, in our case, Aristotle's case, from perception, and can only build from there. And it has to be that case if you're a metaphysical realist, if you believe in the primacy of existence, because if you didn't have this direct, irreducible knowledge of reality, and yet you say reality has to be this way if consciousness is to be right about it, you could never get going. So at a certain point, you just have to be able to get reality. And if your philosophy has, from the very get-go, said you can't get at reality no way, no how, you're not going to get knowledge building it up in that way. What you'll do is take something in consciousness and construct backwards. Now, last point. That was to say that the kind of epistemology and metaphysics underlying reduction, underlying these fundamentality arguments, so what goes on in the epistemology of Aristotelianism, Objectivism, what about what these transcendental arguments show about Kant and subsequent philosophers who have taken on this from Kant? Well, let's take a much more mundane case, and I say I have knowledge of Bigfoot. Now, I couldn't have knowledge of Bigfoot unless there really was a Bigfoot. Therefore, there must be Bigfoot. Now, anyone can see that that's absurd, because what gave you the right to think there was this Bigfoot before you knew that Bigfoot existed? How could you claim to know Bigfoot and yet not already know that Bigfoot exists? Or even say, okay, I know Bigfoot exists, and therefore he must exist. Well, either you could be ridiculously wrong, and this is utterly inconclusive, or you already had prior reason to just see in reality Bigfoot. Reality established it, and that's why you claim to know it. That's to go back to the other side, the other perspective. Or consciousness can make demands on reality. If it's in my head, it must be so in the quote-unquote world. So the only thing that can guarantee that this kind of argument actually goes through, the kind of implicit metaphysical principle that transcendental arguments require to be valid, is some form of primacy of consciousness. Some claim to the effect that consciousness can make the world, the quote-unquote world, in a certain way. And, of course, notice in Kant that we're not using these transcendental arguments to prove the nature of things in themselves. We're using them to prove the metaphysical structure of the phenomena. And it is with respect to the phenomena that the forms of sensibility and understanding, our forms of consciousness, are regulative. No, more than regulative, are legislative. They set the rules for it, but not for things in themselves. Yes, question?
Critical, I think you've already answered this yesterday, a critical part of the argument that if one argued as a metaphysical realist that these categories are simply abstracted from experience, Kant would have said, well, that's therefore contingent, you can't know those for certain, whereas he's arguing these are necessary categories, and anything that's necessary, he'll say, can't be derived from experience. Is that a critical part of his argument? Because how could he dismiss a realist explanation for the categories?
Okay, I mean, yes, he'll say that, did the question come on? Okay, he'll say, look, if it was just some item in experience that from time to time you perceive, or all the time perceive, on that grounds alone you cannot show that it is necessary. Yeah, that's right. And then, so I suppose, are you asking this? Are you asking, is it because he assumes that as a result, these categories are no longer about metaphysics, but are in fact are no longer about external reality, things in themselves, but about consciousness. That is, that the move to shift out of experience does that.
Yes.
Yes and no. I think one can see that as one can see that relationship as one of these symptoms. But at the point at which he's making these arguments, you're already deep into idealism. So, but there is, I think you're right, but let's put it this way. It's not the particular point with regard to the categories that you couldn't get it from experience. But the skepticism about anything that comes through experience is indeed what pushes him to idealism. And that's exactly where our next point is. Oh, no, sorry. The next point. That's item 4 on our handout, the pathology of idealism. You set it up so perfectly, Evan. Thank you. But first, a note on reason and pure reason. I said a little bit yesterday, but really not enough, about this third faculty of knowledge, reason as against sensibility and understanding. And heck, the book's called The Critique of Pure Reason. We haven't even gotten to reason yet, really. In fact, it's funny because most classes, when they do the critique, since it's such a long and challenging book, they don't get to reason. And people are always, why is it called that? So here's the idea. As we said, intuitions give us sensible material, concepts, the understanding gives us concepts and judgments. What reason does is it systematizes concepts and it systematizes judgments, puts them together. Now, Kant does not think that there are any sort of a priori forms of reason. But he does think that we have a kind of natural and an ineliminable tendency to think that reason can set these sort of absolute terms for us, which it really can't. And what is he getting at here? Well, Kant is looking back at centuries, really millennia of rationalist metaphysics that never really went anywhere, and they just fought back and forth, and every so often a skeptic would come and kick them in the pants and knock over their castles in the sand, and then they'd rebuild, but never getting anywhere. And he says, look, here's the problem that these guys have. They think that reason can talk about what's beyond experience. Explicitly, they tell you, you can't see God, you can't hear God, but reason can prove stuff about God anyway. And this he calls pure reason, that is, reason pure of experience. Now, it might surprise you to learn that Kant does not think pure reason is a valid way of knowing anything. Since we can only know things when they have both concepts and intuitions, that is to say, all our knowledge, and certainly all our a priori knowledge, is restricted to the realm of appearances, to phenomena. When we start wondering about things that aren't perceivable, but are beyond the ken of intuition, we get ourselves in trouble. We start talking about things that we could never know about. And that would include God. That would include the immortal soul. That would include a possible beginning in time of the entire universe, because it would be outside of space and time, right? If you were before space and time, you'd have to be outside of it. And also the freedom of the will. Why is that outside? Well, causality, Kant thinks of deterministically, in terms especially of Newtonian mechanics, and so we'd have to be talking about what's outside the purview of the category of causality, that is, and thus outside of this where the categories hold experience. Incidentally, ultimately, though it is a thing in itself, it's noumenal, right? It's not us. Kant does think that we do just directly know the noumenal fact of our freedom, but I'll mention that at the very end. So, what is the point here? So Kant, basically what he does in the dialectic, the second half of the transcendental logic, and then in the doctrine of method, basically roasts rationalist metaphysics and decides he's going to destroy it once and for all. And in a real sense, he did. theology attempts to prove the existence of God, what was called rational theology, or if you attempt to prove the immortality of the soul, rational psychology, or if you attempt to argue whether the universe has a beginning in time or not, rational cosmology. These were all mainstay topics of theology and philosophy. They were center stage, center ring attractions. They play such a minor role in philosophy now. And the reason is because, and the reason people think that they aren't worth talking about is that, Kant basically said, look, you have no way of knowing about this stuff. But that wouldn't have, that alone, even if he had shown why we could never know this stuff, by showing what the limits of knowledge were in experience, you could bet that these guys still would have kept coming and trying to use reason to prove these non-perceivable things. But Kant does them one better. He identifies what they were kind of going on all along. Sure, these guys constructed reasons, and there probably were theologians who really believed God because of some proof. Probably not many. But what Kant said was, look, we can't prove this stuff. It goes beyond experience. What reason is doing, reason is always trying to systematize things. And it gets so wrapped up in it, it goes beyond experience. And then we have what he calls transcendental illusion, belief in things beyond sense, because reason's trying to organize them too. And Kant says, fine, look, you can't know that stuff. But you can't know that God exists. But neither can you know that he doesn't. Okay, so it'll never be solvable if he is or if he isn't. But if there's a very good reason, a very good practical reason for believing in God, then let's do it. Because no one's going to prove to us we're wrong. And this is where the idea of what Kant calls regulative ideals come in. Reason has a organizing function. It's always trying to tie things together. For instance, it wants to tie together the order in nature, so physical laws, and at the same time, moral laws. It wants to know that this is a world where we both, are these beings with these bodies, and yet also it's a world where we could succeed in following the dictates that morality has. And so we kind of look for a common source, and that would be God. Or, for example, we want to know that there are simple, basic covering laws for all the different things within appearance. Very little of natural science, at least at this stage in his career, does Kant think is a priori. Most of it, he thinks, is empirical within an a priori framework. But he thinks there's no way we could go do science if we couldn't assume, if we couldn't, at least at the outset, proceed as if there were simple laws, as if there was some order in nature, rather than endlessly complicated rules and structures that we would never get to the bottom of. And that everything was just irresolvably different from everything else. Now, it could be. Up to the point where we could still have self-consciousness. It could be, but how could we do science on that assumption? So we assume it as if it were true, though we'll never know, and we go for it. So this is Kant as laying the kind of foundations for the anti-foundationalist philosophy of pragmatism. This is Kant saying it doesn't matter if we can know it or not, as long as it's, totally one of these undecidable questions and we have some need for it. And sometimes these needs, if this was the case in science, would seem more reasonable. Most of the time, the big things that we make the big assumptions about, God, the immortality of the soul, the freedom of the will, we make those assumptions for moral reasons. That is that because we have certain moral duties, and because it's hard to pursue them, it's hard to get up in the morning if you're a Kantian unless you can somehow believe that you're going to get rewarded for all of this, or even that your soul will last forever so you can keep working on becoming more dutiful, or that the highest good is possible, that is a world where all rational beings are perfectly dutiful and have as much happiness as consistent with that. You couldn't buy into that unless you could tell yourself there was God. You couldn't even buy into morality at all unless you could tell yourself that you had a free will. And no one's going to prove it wrong, but no one's going to prove it right. So it's the story you tell yourself. And thus these ideas, not concepts, serve this kind of guiding role for your life and for your cognition, and you organize what you do around them, even though you have no way of knowing if they're true or false. And never could. Yeah.
So would it be fair to boil that down by saying that what Kant did was remove the fear of rational refutation from people who want to believe in these ideas, and that's why they no longer feel compelled to, try to rationally defend them?
Yes, I think that's correct. Did you get his statement?
I did.
Okay, yeah, I think that's correct. That is, yes. And he would say, I agree. He would say, I found it necessary to deny knowledge to make room for faith. The specific kind of knowledge he's talking about here is what was allegedly knowledge of things in themselves, knowledge about God, the soul, the will. He's denied it. You can't know that, but so don't worry about that and worry about what you need faith for. So yes, I think that's right. Now, okay. Having said that, one second. Having said that, I think we've done good service to having covered most of the main points certainly of a doctrine of elements. Not all the details by any means. And the doctrine of method contains both the discipline of pure reason, that is how you teach yourself not to overstep this, and how you use a good kind of skepticism. But it also has, the canon of pure reason, and where he talks about positively in terms of natural knowledge, what kind of posits you make. So you assume that nature has simple laws, you assume that there's a system, and so forth. That too, we're going to kind of just leave aside with just that note about what's there. And now we're going, I think, to come back to the question Evan raised and start really trying to understand Kant at a deeper level about how did we get here? How did a guy who wasn't certifiably insane and was absolutely a mental powerhouse, which had not been seen in philosophy, and someone on his level hadn't been seen in philosophy since Aristotle, maybe Aquinas, right? But I mean, this guy has power up to wazoo in his mind. How could he come up with this view where everything you know is not about the real world, and that this is all in your head? I mean, if someone walking down the street said that to you, you would call for the guys in the white van. But not only did Kant come up with this, but it swept through philosophy. So what made this plausible? What got him to this point, and what made idealism, the idea that what we're aware of is what's in our mind, not reality itself, what made that attractive?
Drugs?
No. Not funny. It would be funny if it weren't so dangerous. Okay. I don't need to write this down. Here I'm going to start telling you about the ways in which I think Plato and Kant are very similar, because Plato also initiates a phase in Greek thought. There had been a little bit before with Parmenides, but really makes it a mainstay, also where this world, the real world, isn't real, and that something beyond the real world is which has all these cognitive-like properties, is what's really real. And I think there's a common story about how these views, Plato's view and why he got to the forms, and Kant's view and why he got to the categories and such, how they emerged. And let's start, and here's where I think things start, for them, not before them, but for them. Chomsky identifies and uses as the basis of his own sort of nativist, innate knowledge kind of program, what he calls Plato's problem. And I think it is Plato's problem. And here's the problem that, but the philosopher scratches his head about. We have all this conceptual knowledge. We know math, we know the rules of grammar, Hey, we even have moral knowledge of what's right and wrong. We've got a lot of stuff that we know about. But all these people start telling us that our knowledge starts from experience. But look at perception. It's crap. There's no possible way from experience that we could ever get to the kind of absolute certain knowledge, absolute certain timeless, universal knowledge, which concepts and judgments and theories and science holds for us. So something else, if we really do have that knowledge, something else has to be helping us out here. Now, when you confront this problem, that is the paucity of the cognitive resources or the grounds for further conceptualization in experience, in perception, when you admit that, you can go one of two ways. You can go the way of the empiricists who deny innate knowledge, deny the forms, and then, the empiricists do accept this point about the paucity of experience. Indeed, they are often, it's some people like that give this stuff to Kant, and in a slightly different way, the Heracliteans give this stuff to Plato about the lack of order in the sensible world. Not Heraclitus, the Heracliteans. They go skeptic, right? They say, yeah, I guess this is what we start with. And, in the case of somebody like Hume, no, we don't have access to the forms or something like that. Well, then I guess we just don't have this knowledge, or it's not nearly as certain as we once thought it was. It's, probable. It's our best guess from whatever little bits of guesswork we can do from this junk we call sensation. Or you can go the other way. And the other way is this. Of course, there's a third way, which is to actually get the right view of perception where it can be the proper basis of knowledge. But hold off on that for a moment. You can say, fine, perception doesn't give us knowledge. It doesn't give us necessary knowledge of cause and effect. Hume proved that for me, says Kant. Perception doesn't tell me the way things always are. It only gives me things that are relatively such and such. I only see a guy who's tall from one perspective and short from another perspective. I see two sticks that are kind of close to equal, but are not exactly equal. Where did I get this equality from? Says Plato. I must be getting, but I do have causal knowledge, says Kant. But I do understand the mathematical idea of equality itself, thinks Plato. It must be coming from somewhere other than experience. So that's the step that gets you other knowledge other than experience that's not in experience. What happens then? Well, it's only if wherever this conceptual information or those things which can guarantee that there'll be conceptual information, things that are really universal, things that are really timeless, or structures that ensure that everything will be causal. It's only when those things, the forms, the categories, space and time, can impress themselves on experience, bend experience to their will, more or less. It's only in that case then that conceptual knowledge we thought we had applies in any respect to this world. Now, of course, any kind of empirical cognition that we have in the phenomenal realm, Kant thinks is uncertain, even though it's in a framework of some things we know because of the categories. Likewise, anything that goes on in this sensible world, Plato thinks is going to be kind of dicey, even though, to some extent, there's stability guaranteed by these really perfectly stable, timeless things, the forms. What we in effect have is this other metaphysical stuff, which has all the properties of conceptual consciousness, or that which would guarantee it. That is, the identity here is just is just the kind of formal nature of conceptual knowledge, and that stuff can impress itself on experience to make sure that we can have that knowledge. Now, this view that this prior intellectual, conceptual content must be presupposed for knowledge and must impose itself on this here in order to make that possible for us to have that knowledge, I call either idealism, though some people only want to talk about that when the structures are consciousness and the forms aren't consciousness, or noeticism, from the term nous, or noetic, intelligible, intelligence. And this is where I think idealism really gets going. Now, Plato and Kant both still have a kind of minor role left for reality in itself to play. For Kant, the thing in itself somehow, who knows how, affects our transcendental mind somehow, who knows how, not causally, in such a way that there's this incoming data, the manifold of representations, this purely raw stuff, which then gets structured. So the fact that there's any kind of phenomenal experience at all rather than none, still for Kant requires this raw small bit of input, characterless as it is, uncognizable as it is, of material from things in themselves. Plato likewise says that to have this physical world, you need this raw kind of space, this blank matter, which he calls the receptacle, on which the forms can reflect, over which God can arrange the forms in various mathematical patterns such that we get a semi-stable world. But the next step is to kick that last finger hold on the world away. In the case of German idealism, immediately after Kant, I mean, literally within a span of 10 years after 10 years after the Critique of Pure Reason is published, 15 max, absolute idealism, where you've gotten rid of the thing in itself altogether, and where consciousness is supplying its own incoming material and just works on itself, has dominated. Why? So long as you were talking about this thing in itself, there was this skeptical problem. Well, okay, but that's the real thing, right? How do I know it? And how do I know my mind can apply itself on that stuff? But at the same time, what work was it really doing? It doesn't make experience the way it is as against isn't. All the content of experience comes from the form of our cognition, so let's just do away with it. And there you get, there is no reality beyond consciousness, which is even a further step from, there's reality beyond consciousness, we don't know that, we know consciousness. So that, I think, is the kind of way, in general, schematically, that this goes. Now, how different, now just to further press this point, in my own work, I erode some of the differences between Plato and Kant, because people will say, Plato's the arch-realist. There are these, for any time we have knowledge, there's this real thing out there, the beautiful itself, and that's how we know anything is beautiful. So he's super realist. And Kant is anti-realist, because what is in our head, what we have knowledge of, has nothing to do with things in themselves. And I think this is not the essential way to categorize them. It is a difference, and it's an important difference. But notice for a moment that for Plato, every time he characterizes the forms, every time, what he starts with is a characterization of a certain kind of knowledge. And then, so starting from that kind of epistemological consideration, then goes over to the metaphysics and just attributes to them whatever kind of properties would seem to kind of set up that knowledge. So they're very much these super individual objects that would somehow give us concepts, or that would remove the need for a mental integration by just being a super metaphysical integration. And on the other hand, so how far from human cognition is this image of the forms? I mean, is this story about the forms? Turn it the other way. How psychological are the categories. I mean, I wanted to say, Plato is an ontological idealist. Kant is a psychological idealist or noeticist. I mean, how psychological is it? We've shown in the first two classes, but it's not you, Don Watkins, it's not you, John McCaskey, it's not me, Jason Rines, in which these categories as structures reside. It's in this prior mind before me where it is. So it's nothing you have psychological access to. It's nothing that looks anything like the concepts you have, though presumably you have the categories as concepts too, but you have them within experience rather than the structures prior to. So I mean, this noumenal self, how much does that really look like our mind anymore? Even if the story about how things get structured is a story about consciousness rather than a story about another metaphysical realm. And just to show you that, just to bear this out, one of the first kind of questions that arose for followers of Kant was, well, how do we know that each of us has these categories rather than there just being one noumenal mind? There's just one set of categories, and then it filters through there, and then it splits into lots of little minds. Which incidentally was a Neoplatonist view of reason and the soul as well. So that's just all to say, that's just all to kind of work away this difference and understand that they're both cutting us off from knowledge of the real world for the same reason, namely they're assuming conceptual knowledge, mathematical knowledge, moral knowledge, but without its perceptual base, and then have to make something up beyond it to give us that. Now this is to make them seem really close to each other. And just one more thing to make close is that when it comes to morality, or knowing the freedom of the will, at least a couple years later, by 1788, the Critique of Practical Reason, Kant has gone sort of, with regard to freedom of the will and duty, full mystic. He doesn't come out and say it, but, well, he basically does say it a couple of times, that we just know what our duty is. We just know that the noumenal I, the guy who isn't structured by causality, is free, and then we proceed morally from there. So he has that's even more, to load that side up. But I do think there are real differences, though I think the similarities are greater than the differences. And I want to now kind of come to my final major point of the course, and that is, how does Kant stand in relationship to other philosophers, including Plato? So, Eric, if you could come up here and while you do that, I'll answer that question.
Yeah. My question is, so Kant says that we know that we need to do because we know duty and we know how we have to live, or does he say that we can choose to have faith on the fact that we have free will and that we have a duty, or we can choose not to, and then all these two possibilities?
The question is, does Kant say we know we have a duty, or does he say we can choose on faith to believe we have free will to follow duty? The former. Now, in the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, which is earlier than the Critique of Practical Reason, the idea is, well, morality couldn't be binding on us, and so there it seems like he thinks he has to be able to prove the possibility in the noumenal world of freedom if there's possibly to be duty. But there's a tension there, because he doesn't say, well, it seems like there could be duty. He says, you and I and everybody else absolutely know we have duty. And all his proofs about the freedom of a will in the third part of the groundwork have all these problems associated with them. And so just a couple of years later, he's flipped his position. And this is the view. We do know that morality holds for us. And morality couldn't hold for us, there couldn't be things we ought to do unless we have a choice. And so it must be evident to ourselves, in thinking of ourselves as rational beings, that we're free. Or another way he puts it as, when we think of ourselves as rational beings, we think of ourselves as noumena, as things in themselves. All right. Trichotomies. Kant in relation to everybody else. I want to start with just build ourselves up to kind of certain philosophical trichotomies and then where Kant fits or really kind of doesn't fit in. Okay. So take a trichotomy here. There's the idea that you should sacrifice others. There's the idea that others, that you should sacrifice yourself. And of course, there's an idea that you shouldn't sacrifice anybody, right? 3 options. Don't look at this one, don't look at this one, just look at this one. Okay? Sacrifice others, and when we talk about, sacrifice ourselves for others, and we call that, or sacrifice ourselves for something else. When it's for others, it's altruism. Sacrifice other things for you, which we call pseudo-egoism or rational egoism, and don't sacrifice, which is an element of rational egoism. Now notice that these 2 views, sacrifice others, sacrifice self, accept that sacrifice is morally acceptable, even morally necessary, whereas this one recognizes that sacrifice is not in anyone's self-interest, is not moral, and denies it outright. So these 2 views, others sacrifice, self-sacrifice, already are sort of in agreement on a fundamental principle, or rather we should say they both disagree with the same fundamental principle, which is in the truth. Now, one can, so let's take this idea here. One can within the rejection of no sacrifice, within the sacrifice zone here in the diagram, right? You could have different orientations of whom, in general you prefer to see sacrificed. Now, let me just make an important point. It's not that the altruists get right not sacrificing others. And it's not even that the irrational egoists get right not sacrificing yourself. Altruists sacrifice people all the time in the name of the common good. Irrational egoists do all sorts of things that are not in their interest and are totally self-destructive, right? None of these guys get it right, even half right. But they do orient themselves to one side rather than the other. And of course, altruists do things like irrational egoists. Irrational egoists can do altruistic things. It's not that one person only is in one camp or the other, but one has tendencies. Now, one could say, what altruism is on the principle, within this sacrifice thing, altruism is on the principle, this is represented on this diagram by the red, that you should sacrifice oneself and don't sacrifice anything else for oneself. Okay? The irrational egoism, which, is the blue here, is sacrifice the other, don't ever sacrifice for the other. Okay? Now notice these are not exclusive of one another. You can have both. You can say sacrifice for self, sacrifice other, and don't sacrifice for self, and don't sacrifice for other. And what are you left with? Sacrifice everybody for nothing. And there is such a view. Sacrifice for its own sake, or nihilism. Represented here in the purple where the red and the blue meet. Now, the idea of doing your duty not for any other sake, for any gain, even for others' gain, is a core point of Kantian ethics, which will come up in Kant too. But this is just, and I think Kant does fall here in the middle of the bad views, but that was just to kind of get your head around the idea that these trichotomies leave open the possibility of a fourth view, which is like the anti-good view. These 2, the ones on the wings, they get caught up in a non-essential difference between themselves. And they spend a lot of their time attacking one another, the red and the blue. Even though they do agree on the fundamental principle. And what the worst view does is it just gets clear what it's really all about and just goes whole hog with that principle. So it's the anti-good or the anti-true. All right, let's do the next one. So now let's look at how this plays out in Kantian epistemology. Now, with respect to concepts, or let's say a priori concepts, is Kant an intrinsicist or a subjectivist? Huh? Yeah, I should have asked that before I did that. Yeah, no, he's one. This is all a big tease. Right, he's both. Let me show you why. Now, the fundamental principle here that distinguishes intrinsicism from subjectivism from the right view, objectivism, is the following. Concepts are objective. That's what the true view is based on, and the other views in some form or another, except that they're not objective. Understand that objectivity with regard to knowledge has two components. One, that it's formed volitionally, that we have to choose to form it, and that we could do it in different ways, and have to do it in a certain way to do it right. And two, that we have to do it on the basis of the world really being a certain way. So it has a metaphysical component, the world really is a certain way, with real similarities and differences, which give rise to real cognitive needs to sort this stuff out, but we have to make the choice to do it. Okay? Now, subjectivists frequently go kind of intrinsicist, intrinsicists frequently go subjectivist. These are not, don't think that somebody always fits neatly into one of these, or even someone who absolutely is an intrinsicist doesn't have his subjectivist moments. They agree on the same fundamental principle, but they emphasize, or they're oriented to, both of them are oriented to sort of rejecting one half of the two conditions. So what the intrinsicist says is, concepts are based in reality. It's just that we don't have to do anything volitionally with our consciousness to get them. Their nature is established, the conceptual nature of them is established beyond us. And remember, neither of the guys on the wrong side get any of it right. It's not like intrinsicists get the way in which concepts are based on reality correctly. They just put some kind of essence or form out there, which is not the way that reality grounds concepts anyway. Likewise, subjectivism. They focus on the fact that we form concepts volitionally, we carve the world up, but with no basis of reality. Reality doesn't prefer it one way or the other. And notice again that they get the volition part wrong, because when we form concepts, we're not just arbitrarily picking some things out of a bag and go, okay, shiny, yellow, and in Jason's pocket, that'll be schmold. That's not what we do. But now look, if you think that concepts are not based on reality, but they're our activity, our putting them together, and you also think that it's not like we pick and choose them, they're just given in a certain way, then what do you have? You have the categories. We have no choice about forming them or not. They're just given to us. They're manifest in every experience that we have and every judgment that we make. And yet they have nothing to do with reality. So with regard to the categories at least, Kant has the worst elements of intrinsicism and subjectivism. Now, the reason that in general people following Kant tended more towards subjectivism than intrinsicism is this. They never really bought, nor did they have any good reason to buy, his account of why the categories never change, or that they're absolutely the same for all people. With Hegel, you get the idea that from time to time, this a priori structure changes, it evolves. And people in one stage, the world appears a certain way, and to other people at a different stage, it appears a different way. And that's the kind of idea still synchronically with relativism. Your culture has this conceptual framework, and it seems like this to you, but they have this other one. So because they didn't see any kind of really good reason for buying the givenness and the universality of this, they tended to go subjectivist from Kant. But Kant himself has the elements of both. And notice how dangerous it is, because he precisely picks axiomatic concepts. which are ones that you could reasonably think are totally universal and omnipresent in all awareness. And he makes those subjective. So, I mean, it's not like the things he picked were utterly foreign to the idea of being universal not only to all people, but to all experience. All right, next one. All right, let's now look at mysticism, skepticism, Aristotelianism, and what I say is Kantianism. Now, I take it, there are various ways, I mean, with all of these categories, there are various ways you could describe the kind of principle they're disagreeing about that are more or less really close to the same thing. So for our purposes here, I'm not saying there isn't another way to categorize it in terms of mental process, but for our purposes here, I'm distinguishing Aristotelianism, the view that the mind knows the objective sensible world, from mysticism and skepticism. They deny that we can really know the sensible world. That's where they get started. Plato thinks that, Hume thinks that. Then what do they disagree about? They disagree about whether there's something else to know. And the skeptic says, I don't know. Maybe, but I wouldn't know. Or just no. And the mystic says, I'll show you another world, and we can know that. The mystics do claim that sort of derivatively, they have trickle-down metaphysics. Derivatively, by knowing the forms, you can know a little bit about this world, because it reflects them a bit. But really, what mystics want to tell you about is not this world. They've given up on knowing this world. They want to tell you about the other world. Okay? And there's a very good reason for that. When they start making claims and making predictions about this world, they get proven wrong really fast, and everyone knows they're full of you-know-what. But as long as they're talking about something beyond space and time, like God. Oh, I don't know. I mean, yeah. Oh, you can tell me about God? Well, I don't see him. No, you're not supposed to see him. Oh, okay. Now, if you accept that there is no other world we can know, but also accept that there is a world more real than this one, what do you get?
Religion.
No. That's the mystic. The mystic says, in certain we have certain revelation of this other world. If you accept the skeptic that there's nothing else we know about either, but you also say, but there is something else. Okay, so you know at least one thing. There is that other world, and it's really real. Then you have Kant's noumenal-phenomenal distinction. There is this really real world, and we know nothing about it, well, except duty and free will. And yet, we're skeptical of it. So there's this other world out there, the more real world, which stands around in order to discredit that which we do have alleged knowledge of. It's there to make the phenomenal world merely appearance, because that's what's really real, and yet we can't even know that other thing. Now, in that respect, Kant is worse than Plato. Although, insofar as Platonists really only emphasize the other world and not knowing this world, but there is no other such world, and this is the only world there is, they also make human life and human knowledge impossible, and they lead to the Dark Ages and all sorts of horror. So I'm not giving them a pass, but yeah.
Second chart, it's really difficult to make
Oh, yeah, so the mind knows the objective sense of the world. That's a principle of, Aristotelianism, that kind of approach to knowledge. And then the skeptics and Kant agree that there is no other world that we can know. The mystics and Kant agree that there's another more real world. Okay, and there are various ways you could carve this up differently. Let's see how we're doing on time and see if we go through the other ones, or we have 5 minutes? 9 minutes. All right, let me just tell you that effectively I'll just really quickly go through one more. I won't go through the last one. And I'll just hold it up. So if you say we can have valid conceptual knowledge based on perceptual knowledge, that's the kind of right view of the origins and the way we build up knowledge. We have perceptual knowledge, it's not crummy, as in Plato's problem, and we build concepts up from there. Okay? Now, if you deny that, you could be denying the part about having concepts coming from being based on perception. And then still think we can do stuff with concepts. And that's really what rationalists do. They start with concepts, but again, right, but one side doesn't get it right. Neither of these sides, opposite the good principle, get it right. The concepts that they start us off with, these innate ideas, are complete floating abstractions. These are not good concepts. And what they tell us to do with them is not really what, in general, we do with conceptual knowledge. I mean, we do deduce, but that's not all we do. Likewise, the empiricists, they say, well, we don't start from perception and build up to concepts. We start from sensation, and that's why we don't really build up to concepts. And again, it's not like they get the sense part of it right. They're so down on conceptual knowledge because what they start out with is worse than perception. It's something you couldn't get concepts from. But Kantianism has both. It both says that the basic concepts on which all synthetic a priori knowledge depends are unrelated to experience, and these floating concepts unite bare, meaningless sensations. So we have completely blind intuitions, these little bits, organized by completely detached from reality conceptual structures or abstractions. Now again, people fall back to these orientations post-Kant. Though Kant, in a way I guess we don't really have time for, but maybe you could ask me about, influences. I do think it's right to say that rationalism and empiricism after Kant are never the same. But in effect they never were totally exclusive. They were orientations and they had the principle wrong. But what he just goes deeper to the heart of getting rid of conceptual knowledge based on perceptual knowledge. Okay? So, that's the sense in which I want to say that what Kant does is he absolutely put his finger on the essence of these wrong principles, and that's why he doesn't fit neatly into these trichotomies, because he's not one half of the bad or the other half of the bad. He's the bad in all its mightiness, with the worst aspects of both sides. So I like to say he's the black mirror of objectivism. He's our evil double. And he's only thus because he is so fundamental. He says, forget, in effect, he sees past the squabbling of these two sides that have already accepted the false principle and says, let's just emphasize the false principle. And, you're both right about the other being wrong. Okay. That's the last kind of substantive point I wanted to do. So now, we've talked about how Kant combines mysticism and skepticism, gives us a worse epistemology than before. I've mentioned that there is one respect in which he's a pure mystic, that is with regard to the categorical imperative, knowing our duty, and knowing that it does definitely apply to us because we're free. And from there, and now you might think, well, but he wasn't entitled to think that. How could that have been all that influential? I mean, that just seems a self-contradiction in his theory. But notice, even with the most subjectivist subsequent descendant of Kant, the most radical cultural relativist, this is culturally relative, it's not absolute. This is culturally relative, it's not absolute. This is just your upbringing, yada, yada, yada. There is one thing that they always agree on, and they never call into question as relative. Capitalism's bad, selfishness is bad, the West is bad. There's never a question about self-interest being bad. If you put it to them, well, I don't know what they would say. The honest ones would go, yeah, that too. That's a cultural construct. But they have no problem proceeding as if it was absolutely true and not relative in any way. And I don't think that's accidental, that they, in that respect, without being self-consciously mystic, without being open about giving themselves one thing that isn't relative. In a way, Kant is open about giving himself pretty open about giving himself one thing from the noumena. I think it's this. If the essence of that kind of sacrifice is to sacrifice first the mind, then it's only with a kind of thoroughgoing destruction of all our other cognition that you can really get someone to believe absolutely and fully that they must submit. So I don't think it's a mistake that the strongest kind of knowledge undercutting also goes with the most dogmatic insistence on sacrifice. That dogmatic insistence on sacrifice could never get going, could never be able to sway men under its lash unless they were already disarmed by something that crushed their ability to know reality. So that's, I think, the last substantive point. Next year, we're going to actually look at that ethics, an ethics which has utterly swept the world. And that, I'm happy to say, is going to be taught by my friend and colleague from the University of Pennsylvania, Matt Bateman, and I honestly believe he's going to do a phenomenal job. But how will he really do? No, it's going to be terrific, and I strongly recommend you do it. It'll only reinforce and make clearer Kant's theoretical philosophy, and you'll get a better sense of how this faith stuff works. But for now, we leave it at that, and I thank you. Okay, you haven't asked a question yet, sir.
All right. Now, is this a rational argument, a rationalist argument? Say I recognize that there are universals and existential things in existence.
Hold on, Rebecca, are you getting this? Go ahead. I don't want to have to repeat.
All right. So I see there's the world of concepts, and the world of consciousness, and the world of existence, and I also know from logic that there is.
Running out of time.
It's going to be a long time. Okay. There is the argument of the middle term connecting what I want to what I get. And so I am going to identify things I want require things to materials, means. And also a part of the middle term is a method.
Oh, okay. I'm going to cut you off there. I'm going to take a guess at what you're getting at, though I'm not sure it is, and because we need time for other questions. Okay. There's a point about in Kant, maybe this is what he was getting at, I'm not sure, I want to give other people a chance too, about one can't will the ends without willing the means to that ends, and that one can't sort of know the conclusion without knowing the middle terms. So that to know, so to really endorse that you're going for X means you're going to endorse some way of getting X, and to really endorse Y as a conclusion, it's only so because you're endorsing what leads you to that. Is that true? In a very weak sense. If you really are committed to getting something, then you wouldn't be really committed to getting something unless you were willing to take the steps necessary to do it. However, if you commit yourself to doing something, not knowing the steps involved, I'd much more sooner say you just haven't really committed. You haven't thought through it. You've stated a commitment, but that's not the same thing. And likewise, if you say you believe a conclusion, qua conclusion, without really knowing the evidence, then qua conclusion, you don't even know it at all. And so it's even weaker in the case of knowledge. I hope that was what you're getting at. If not, ask me afterwards. Okay. Oh, well, I'll thank you all very much, and you can ask me questions afterwards. Go out and enjoy this phenomenal world of ours. It's phenomenal.